Jonathan, so welcome to Competencies Without a Classroom. Man, I'm super excited to have you here. I've heard only good things, so I'm sure our listeners are going to be excited to hear what you have to say as well. But before we get into that part of it, Jonathan, and dig a little bit deeper on the amazing work that you're doing in the classroom, I got to start this podcast episode the same way we've started every episode so far. It helps to set a bit of a tone for the rest of the interview, and quite frankly, it's what our listeners, they want an answer to. So, Jonathan, when it comes to pineapple on pizza, are you a yes or a no on that one?
Oh, a yes all the way.
Okay.
Like,
I know. Well, you say that like, how could you not say yes? But crazily enough, there are some people that are no's and some people that are like hard no's. So I'm happy to hear that you're in the yes camp. You're in the majority, and that's what our listeners were hoping for. So now that we're off on the right foot, Jonathan, can you give us some background? So who is Jonathan So, and what are you doing for work right now?
so I'm Jonathan So, but I work in Ontario in the Peel District School Board. I've held many jobs. So this year I've actually gone through a bunch of stuff, but I teach K-8, and currently I am in a math resource central role. And before that, at the beginning of the year, I was a learning environment itinerant teacher, so helping teachers dismantle anti-Black racism and racism in their school board.
Okay, very important conversations. And speaking of actually important conversations, Jonathan, one of the cool things I found when I was doing some Googling before we got started was your TEDx talk from a little while ago about kind of active listening and relationships. We'll link to that in the show notes because I think it's a great TED talk for everyone to listen to, but can you give us kind of a summary of what that was all about?
Yeah, so that TEDx came about from my journeys in the classroom and more importantly with my daughter, and what I've learned about relationship building with my students and how important it is just to listen to them and be part of who they are, as well as keeping my own like emotions in check as you deal with some of them. But
Yeah.
those emotions are and those identities are so important to put into the classroom. And so that's what the TEDx is about.
Yeah, I thought it was fantastic being your true authentic self and allowing those around you to be that as well, right? So maybe that's a good segue. Jonathan, the podcast Competencies of the Classroom, season 1, we focused on talking to people in industry. So your CEOs, your hiring managers, kind of debunking what do these 21st century skills that we love talking about, right? Like we love telling our students you need to be a critical thinker, problem solver, collaborator, but what does that actually look like in the workplace? So that's what season 1 was, real examples, what these people are looking for when building out their 21st century teams. Now we have a pretty good sense. We've compiled a fair number of responses and have a good idea of what those skills are. Season 2 is meant to amplify the voice of the educator, because I know I'm in a privileged position. I get to talk to many educators across North America, and I know there's some amazing things happening in the classroom when it comes to empowering our students to develop these future-ready skills. But honestly, I think a lot of those amazing stories are siloed. So I'm trying to use this podcast to share those stories so that someone who's driving to school in the morning can listen to this quick episode, hear an idea, and say, yeah, I like that. I want to bring it back to my classroom. So with that, Jonathan, what's something that you've done in previous years to empower your students in your classroom to develop some of these core competencies?
So probably the biggest shift was, I don't know, it's been about 6 years of doing it, but going gradeless with my students from early as grade 2 all the way up to grade 6, and really allowing them to take control and reins over what grades and how they see themselves as learners. I've always thought about the idea of teachers. We have such privilege and we have such power, and the assessment process is such a one in which we exert our power, and who's to say that as a learner coming into your classroom, like that I'm, as a teacher, I'm the gatekeeper of that grade to say that you're going to pass on or to move on through it. So flipping it on the head and asking kids to look at curriculum, to look and reflect and metacognitively think about how they're doing and building. So this turns into like the assignments in which you look at and asking them, okay, so here's an assignment. I was thinking about what you think and what goals do you think we're going to meet and what expectations are we going to meet? And then as they go through it, it's like, are you meeting them? Are you growing with them? Are you not? And if you're not, where are we going to go with it? Like, how are you going to get there? And a lot of my students came back, from grade 7 and 8, and they're just like, thank you. Like grade 6 is looking at curriculum, reading curriculum maps and trying to figure out where they're going to go and setting goals for the future. Right. Like that really is what we want our students to be coming out of school thinking about, right?
Yeah. And so one, thank you for doing that. I'm a huge believer in this grading less and going gradeless movement for many of the reasons you just talked about. So one of the questions I always have though, for when I'm talking to teachers that are introducing this concept to students and especially related to this podcast, have you done it in such a way where you're kind of relating some of these 21st century skills to, like, they must ask why, right? Like they're coming from another classroom where this is brand new to them, right? For a lot of these students. So are you telling your students, look, we're doing this because for you to understand these standards, for you to have this conversation, that this is you developing your critical thinking skills, this is you developing your analytical skills? Like, do you ever connect the why to these skills, or how do you explain it to students who are brand new to this concept?
Well, definitely. I mean, the first thing we often have is a conversation about what grades do to you. Like,
Right.
what are they needed for? And you know, I'm like, what does it need giving you a B or an A, like the actual letter? And they're like, nothing. I'm like, you're right, nothing.
Yeah.
The letter does nothing for you. But what's more important is the feedback. And I always tell students, I'm like, I personally, I'm tired of you not reading my feedback because all you want to look at is the letter grade. So
Yeah.
now I'm just giving you the feedback, and now I'm forcing you to learn at it. And like, that's the learning process. And I still remember one student coming to me in grade 6, reading at like a grade 1 level, right? And he's like, why bother? I've been reading at this level for 6 years. Why bother? And I said, let's just take a slower approach to it. And so we set small goals, and we bridged that. And by the end of it, he came out of it reading at a grade 4 level. So in one small year, 3 grades of level, and all because he saw himself in a different light than just the grade level in which he, you know, we didn't focus on grades. We focused on the feedback and how to grow from there. And that to me is the amazing component of why we do what we do.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the dream, right? I remember seeing a bunch of studies, and they're pretty popular for anyone who's looked into this kind of ungrading movement. So I'm sure I'll get them wrong, but there was one, really, the one that stuck out to me was they handed back their tests. One of them had just the letter grade, one of them had a combination of letter grade and feedback, and one of them just had feedback. And they found that even the one in the middle, the one that had letter grade and feedback, kid didn't look at the feedback, right? They went right to the letter grade because that's what they're so used to, and that's where they get the feedback in their mind, right? But the true feedback, the growth feedback, comes from the comments and the personalized feedback you're giving them. So really cool to hear a real life story about how that feedback had led that student to level up so much in 1 year, right? It's top of mind for me because I just finished reading this book, and so I just talked about it the other day on another episode. It's called Think Again it's an author named Adam Grant, and it's really just about rethinking all of these preconceived notions that we have in our head. And you know, as teachers, educators love to talk about the ability to learn and unlearn. No one's really, I mean, not to say no one, but we just assume the education system is great because it's what we've always known, and grades have just always been there. But if you take a second and you have stories that show what's possible without grading, when true feedback is incentivized, then there's a lot of powerful things that can happen in the classroom. So thank you for doing what you're doing. And actually, congratulations. You've actually now just been promoted to superintendent for the next 10 minutes because of your amazing work, Jonathan. So it comes with responsibility, though. You've now been tasked with deciding one of these core competencies. So one of these 21st century skills that every one of your graduating grade 12s needs to display evidence of in order to graduate. If you could only pick one, which one would it be?
I only pick one. Oh, I know. I saw that. I would think critical thinking overall over everything, because it envelops everything we do, right? So focusing on critical thinking, focusing on how do we emotionally critically think? How do we think about what information is being shown to us, why that information is being shown to us, whose privilege and power is being part of that? How do our biases affect the ways in which we look, right? Those are all the things that we want to be critically analyzing. And then especially since with all the fake news that's coming out, or who says what and where that information is coming from, and we need it more than ever to be thinking about the information that's being sent to our students and to us in general.
Oh, 100%. It will only become more important, especially as this world gets that much noisier. So yeah, couldn't agree more with you on that one. Jonathan, let's switch over and do some rapid fire questions for you. So what's a life skill that you weren't taught in high school, but maybe that you wish that you were?
So I was fortunate enough to go to an art school in which I had a lot of my own freedom. But I'm thinking in general, just being able to be independent. I mean, I was given that freedom, but I think when I look back at some of the ways in which our system is, we don't give that freedom to allow students to have choice, to make mistakes and then learn from those mistakes in a safe environment, right? And then therefore, when they get older, they're like, oh, what do I do? So I think that's a skill that we need to have.
Yeah, I love that. We've talked again a fair bit on this podcast about risk and failure and the education system and things we could do to let students fail in a safe environment so they can get those reps in and be accustomed and not afraid to fail and when they're leaving the education system, right? So yeah, great answer. You have a billboard, Jonathan. Everyone's going to see this billboard. You can write one thing on it. What does it say?
The one thing it says is be doers instead of just doing, and find the joy in what you're doing.
Yeah, I love that. One of the quotes from the first season was, do over plan. That was one of the guys on the billboard, and right, just be a doer, right? That's where the learning and that's where the growth happens, when you actually do the thing. So I love that a lot. Yeah. And you went to an art school, Jonathan, so this would be an interesting question. Did you have a favorite class in high school growing up?
Probably my music classes going up, but I mean, that's just my passion. So it was in music, and just allowing it, the creativity, the freedom to do what you need to do and be part of the learning and growing. So it's fun.
That's cool. Are you still musically inclined? Do you play anything at home right now?
I still play my trumpet every now and then, but I haven't picked it up in a long time. But it's still there. It's still there.
Yeah, something to dust off this weekend for you.
Yeah.
Jonathan, what's a book that you've read that's had such an impact on you that maybe you wish you would have read it from a younger age?
So I've really been in love with Stuart Shanker's work on self-reg. And then the most important one that I've been reading lately is thinking about culturally responsive pedagogy in the brain. And so that's Zaretta Hammond's work, and just thinking about that joy again, and the privilege and power that we have as educators. I think, even as a kid, if I read that, right, thinking about, not that I would read about joy and that, but thinking about who I was, right, and and how that affects the ways in which we walk and see the world, I think is important to think about.
Super important to think about. It's an important lens to apply to everything, to take a step back, like you said, critically think and say, how is power involved in this dynamic right now, right? Speaking of books or reading, and you talked about going gradeless, do you have any, 6 years ago when you were on this journey, or even now, any resources for the teachers listening about things they can read or check out to get started? Or is it just kind of trial by fire? Any recommendations?
So in one of my blog posts that I have on my website we can get to later, but is looking at Starr Sackstein's work. Yeah. She's an amazing educator, but she has tons of stuff that kind of got me settled on that ideas. And then lately it's been thinking about just about how assessment affects the ways in which we serve our students, right, in general. So yeah. I've been looking at a new book from Rehumanizing Mathematics for Black and Indigenous and Latinx students. That's by the NCTM and a bunch of other educators in there. Yeah. And just rethinking how that affects the ways in which we see students, and how assessment is overall as a teacher, the ways in which we pigeonhole kids into things, and stream kids and not stream kids, things like that.
Yeah. Okay, we're gonna have a lot of books to link to in the show notes, which I love. And Jonathan, I already feel like we need to have you back for a deeper dive conversation about this amazing work that you're doing right now. So before we do that, if you had a magic wand, Jonathan, you could change one thing about the education system. It sounds like there's a lot that you may want to change or tweak, but if you could pick one thing, what would it be?
The one thing is that we need to decentralize us as teachers and think about the ways in which we have systematically erased students. And honestly, the one thing would just be like blow it up and start all over again. But that's a huge ways in which we've systematically done things is wrong.
It's cool to hear you say that, man, because I'm not an educator myself, and I think about it all the time, like, why can't we just blow it up? And I know it's way easier said than done, but it's one of those things that, like, too big to fail, but it needs to fail. And we need, like, there's so many people with so many smart ideas, like you're just talking about, that are just, as long as we're playing within the system, we're not going to get the 10x growth that we really need. So I know another podcast for another day, but it's really cool to hear you say that, man. So you mentioned your blog. Where can people go to learn a bit more about you? We'll link to all the stuff, but for people listening right now, where should they go?
Probably the easiest place is Twitter. So at Mr. So Classroom, or my blog is mrsoclassroom.wordpress.com, I think.
Yeah, and we'll link to it. I think you got it right. Yeah. So Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for the work that you're doing in the classroom as well, and hope you have a fantastic weekend.
Yeah, thank you so much.